We'd like to begin by acknowledging that today's session comes to you from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Unless you are elsewhere than Vancouver, I am on the Cookite land, and we'd like to also acknowledge the generous support of Creative BC and the province of British Columbia, City of Vancouver, and of course our host organization, the Red Chamber Cultural Society.
Can you tell a little bit about yourself, your background, and then maybe a little bit about Producers Lounge and what you guys have been up to, what you've been doing?
Sure. So I've been involved in the creative industries since I was very young. I was in a touring band for, 15 or 20 years of my own, and as a session player, which was a really great foundation for eventually becoming a music producer. Had the privilege of traveling, and whether it was playing drums or bass, or with my own act playing this very guitar here, I was just saying that I've had since I was 15, that I still keep in my possession. Got to do a lot of traveling and meet a lot of folks, which really set me up in a way that allowed me to shape a life that was focused on music, art, and community. And that was before I moved to Canada in late 2016. I was based in Melbourne and working in a music studio there. And since moving here, I've established this spot that I'm in now, Capsule Studios, which is actually inside a shipping container hidden in the city of Vancouver. And we run a variety of programs out of this space. There's 4 different producers that work out of here, including we've got a couple of awesome young Indigenous interns up and coming who are also working with folks from the local community, as well as Catherine Hiltz. Some of you might know Catherine from playing on Tegan and Sarah's record bass. She's pretty amazing. Marianne Cheddar works out of here. And then Producers Lounge is an event that we have been putting on for 3 years now, or more of a series, I guess you'd say, a mentorship series, a little bit like this, that originally began in studios with hands-on equipment to offer women and non-binary folks the opportunity to explore equipment, ask questions in a non-confrontational environment. We all like music studios, and at their best, they're incredible, but they can also, be places where toxic masculinity can be kind of scary and you don't feel like asking any questions, or, if you're a beginner, it's very difficult to kind of get your hands on the gear and have that opportunity. So the original spirit of Producers Lounge was to create safe spaces for people to explore and engage with learning more technical knowledge. And then the pandemic happened, and we evolved things a little more into this format that we're in together right now, and started, continuing our meetups online so that we could all keep a great sense of community and share our creative projects while we endured our isolation, which maybe is coming to an end now. We'll see. The program is, however, online still this year. We've been lucky enough to have guests like Linda Perry from Four Non Blondes and Wendy and Lisa from Prince's Band. And we're actually going to meet one of my personal heroes in June. You all should come and watch the broadcast. It's Susan Rogers, who made Purple Rain, the record, and was with Prince from the 84 to 87 period. And she's gone on to become a scientist and works at Berkeley in psychoacoustics, and explores she's about to put a book out in September around music and how it shapes our personality and our brain, what the music you like tells you about your personality. So we kind of have a mixture of technical stuff, supportive mentorship based things like the Denise Dion beatmaking workshop we did last week that give you kind of practical ideas around your creativity, and then just chats, networking, and ways to connect with other women and non-binary producers in the local community, of which, since we've been running for 3 years, now there's a lot, because we've created a supportive community where more folks have been comfortable to enter into the field. And it's really quite an exciting time for Vancouver and surrounds. Yeah.
So exciting. So amazing. What got you into producing? Like, I know that a lot of times when I find that I'm trying to do something, it's because there was a lack and I need to create a space for myself. So is that something that you were finding either back in Melbourne or even here, that you were like, you know what, I need this for myself, and so I'm going to give it to everybody? Or is there a different kind of spark that kind of started for you, or were you doing it back in Melbourne? I heard Melbourne, incredible music community.
Yeah. Melbourne has a great scene going on, and I was really very lucky to be part of that for years, but still have the opportunity to travel and meeting a lot of artists during my touring career has essentially helped a production career, because I can draw on some of those artists to guest on things, and also people have traveled here now to work with me, which has been great. But at the beginning, I guess if I take it right back, I started playing guitar when I was 10 and in bands when I was 13 or 14, and my first recording experiences were on really old 90s analog tape machines, like 4-track machines. My band Gertrude made our first recording in 1996 in a garage on one of those. And so I've had a passion for recording throughout my musical career. And then I started producing other artists in about 2010 because I just became obsessed with the studio process, making some of my own works. I had some really great experiences with a few great mixers and producers where I probably drove them crazy. And I'm like, oh, what are you doing now? What's this? And one guy that I paid a fortune to mix a record of mine, and he also had to kind of give me a crash course while I'm like, oh, and this is, and I was like, okay, this is exciting. And this isn't as difficult as I thought, as we like hopped into the digital domain and things became more accessible with what you could do on computers, not having to have like masses of gear necessarily in order to be creative. And then I was lucky to make a few records more for folk artists initially, because I was sort of in rock, folk, sort of organic band scenarios for years. And it's only in the last 5 years or so that I'm making a lot more hip hop and pop music, as we all cyborg ourselves into like semi-analog, semi-computer world. But it was actually a really bad hand injury that made me make the switch. Like after years of playing a lot of guitar and probably being a little rock and roll in my touring, my buddy was like, oh, no, you don't. And I thought that life was over for a little while, around about 2012, 13. And I haven't put this out very broadly publicly, but I don't mind talking about it now because I've recovered enough. But I just wasn't able to play really technical guitar and bass the way I did because of a hand injury. And I still wanted to be involved in music. So I just pushed further into making more and more records for other people. And I was lucky from my years of touring that I had enough connects to make that happen initially in Australia. And then I took a really big leap of faith and moved countries in my mid-30s to come to North America, because I thought there would be more opportunities here, not just for production, but I also, I'm not sure if you all know, I have a licensing agency called Arrival Sounds, and we represent about 60 artists for film and television from both Canada and from Melbourne. So these things kind of have interplay, because we make custom tracks and I try and create outcomes for artists that record at the studio. And yeah, so I guess in this leap of faith of moving to North America, I knew being closer to Los Angeles and the film industry was going to add up to a lot more than what could go on in Melbourne in that regard. And then moving here, I got super inspired, meeting lots of amazing musicians in the local community. I already knew some from touring here. I'd played a lot of hippie festivals in the hills, kind of as the loud band after the folk bands. Back when my name was backwards, I used to be in a band called Aurora Jane. That's my Southern Hemisphere name, and I flipped it when I moved up here. Yeah, and then I got involved in the local community, and then actually, you know what, I guess I'll be honest about, my mother passed away, which was a hugely unexpected event, and she was one of my closest people, and she's about to come and visit out here. This is in 2018, and I'd been talking to her about the plan to make this studio that I'd kind of seeded from reading Questlove's book, Creative Quest. I don't know if any of you all have read that, but wow. It changed the course of my attitude towards music business, which honestly shits me, even though I figured out a way to kind of engage to have a career. But Creative Quest taught me to be able to view music business in a more creative way and become a bit more of a risk taker. And I was telling my mom about the plans to build this studio and this idea of doing a women's production concept, because there really weren't many people. There's myself, there's Elisa Pangsang, there's Lynn Gardner, there's Olivia in town sort of working at a full-time level. There's only a couple other folks apart from that. And I have had a lot of historical experience working on Indigenous communities in Australia for over 10 years on hip hop projects, working with youth, etc. So lots of interest in community engagement and living in a new place, and all kind of wrapped up in the feelings of the shock of the loss of my mom. I was like, I'm gonna live and I'm gonna do all these intense things. And it pushed me into building the studio and making sure I had to follow through with all these great creative ideas that I was discussing with her right before she passed. And I was like, I have to follow through with these things, you know, even though this shocking event happened in my own life and I had to go back to Australia and deal with that, I just wanted to have the follow through to be really engaged on a community level, because that's something my mother did for years. She was involved in a lot of groups supporting refugee women and in the regional town that I grew up in. And yeah, I wanted to make sure, alongside all of the kind of name and light stuff everyone always dreams of in music, which honestly, you know, it's ridiculous, that I address the heart of what really mattered, which is community, connectivity, offering opportunities, and like feeling a sense of community and spirit in the work, instead of just this weird deifying complex people get about the music industry. And I guess I say that because I just watched the Kanye trilogy and it's like, oh, that's what it's like to think you're a god, which is the opposite of like wanting to just make beautiful stuff with your friends to bring joy to people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so sorry for your loss. I am so close to my mom as well. And that's a really big loss. So I feel for you there. And good on you for taking her legacy and driving yourself forward. Like, if that's not the most beautiful tribute to the love of your mother and the relationship you had, I can't tell you what would be more, more touching. That's incredible. I love, I'm obsessed with the fact that you are so community oriented. And I think that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to collaborate with you. So I think that's just incredible. And, I've obviously seen all of those projects like Mixed by Mail, and that you've been doing with Mary, and you guys obviously have the Mary Jane Hi-Fi, Connect. We had Mary as a guest last season. And so there's so many connections, and it's so funny that we've never really met before, because there's so many, like threads that are common.
Like my girlfriend sings on her record.
Yes. So her girlfriend was singing on my backing vocals on my last record, and I was like, this is just such an amazing small world. And she goes by Ms. Quincy, her artist name.
She's doing some stuff as Jody Peck now, as well. She's about to release more of like a vintage country thing because she's from up north. But I think, it's so beautiful what you mentioned. What we have going here in Vancouver, and I'm so lucky that I moved here, is the city and BC surrounds as well for any folks further afield. It's a small enough community, and we've been blessed with enough arts funding. I know that's our other topic, that throughout these really difficult years of the pandemic, there's like a huge feeling of connectivity and support instead of a competitive nature going on. Because it's like there is enough room in this community for us all to uplift each other, to be yes people and be like, yes, that's good too. And that's what I love about being here and why this stuff has been successful. Because, through these difficult times globally, I feel like, for the most part anyway, especially amongst the women, non-binary folks, that we're all really uplifting each other and finding ways for us to, heal each other and share our creativity in these times instead of being competitive. And that's such a gift.
Absolutely. That's been a shift for me that's completely changed the trajectory and the purpose and the everything of my career. Just recognizing that when you can uplift together, there's just so much more light to be shed on the entire garden, as opposed to, everybody kind of creating their own tiny little pod. I think it's so much better when we can all work together like that. So we'll get to talking about the funding, but let's first start talking about, which I think is just a fascinating subject, is the artist producer relationship, because that's something that I've never really had a super healthy thing for myself. I might be speaking only here on my own island here, but as you mentioned before, there's a lot of toxic masculinity that can happen. I've lost a lot of money, ruined complete projects because I made the wrong choice or the wrong whatever when I came to choose a producer for projects. And this is not just a one-off. It's been like a consistent thing that's happened through my career. So I would love to hear, a bit more about that, what you have to say on that, and how we can, prevent, hopefully, moving forward. And it's these kinds of communities that do that, but like, how can we sort of, get ahead of that game?
Good question. And, ultimately, I guess locally, we're in the middle of a little bit more of that with programs like this that you're doing with this very supportive mentorship programs where we can share information. At its best, Oh my God, this is so funny. My girlfriend just texted and she's on the ferry and she left the lights on my car and she needs to know how to boost it. Give me 1 second. I just have to write her a quick message.
Yes.
I'm so sorry. Krystle,
No.
tell them about your experience producing for a second.
I was going to say that's happened to me so many times because for some bizarre reason, like the same car's been in my life for like, I'll tell everybody else while she focuses, for like 20 years nearly. And my mom passed me down her car. That's the car that I drive now. And that thing's battery dies constantly. You can just leave the radio on for 10 minutes without the engine and the thing dies. So I get it. I'm there with you. In the meantime, hi, everybody. What up, Alexis? What up, Annie? Oh my God, I love seeing you guys here. This is so cool. And hello to everybody else who has never been a part of an Emergence session before. I'm so jazzed that this is such a beautifully populated session today. And of course, it's because the fabulous Jane Aurora is here sharing her amazing information. So let's open it up to some questions and some dialogue. Alexis, I know that I've seen you at many concerts doing, sound and stuff. Do you tell us what you guys tell us about yourselves?
I guess for myself, I started doing recording. I was really lucky straight out of high school to work at Mushroom Studios. So I started there, got to work on a bunch of amazing records. And it was Mushroom when it was owned by Hipposonic. So I've helped move recording studios a few times. A lot of the people were really lovely. And then I went to work at CBC as a recording broadcast engineer, working for Canada Live, getting to record symphonies and stuff, which was really awesome.
Amazing.
But one of the things from my experience growing up from like the engineering side is like when you're a runner and then you become an assistant and then you try to make the jump to engineer, that can be really tricky, regardless of your gender. But I found when I tried to make the jump to engineering, I did work with High Society making their first debut album, which was so much fun, and worked with some other people. But then after CBC, I went to the funding at CBC got cut, so my job disappeared. So then I ended up pivoting into live sound, which has been my focus of late, because I found it easier to make a viable living doing live sound in comparison to recording. But I still like all the stuff. And around 2015 is when somebody introduced me to Sound Girls. Does anybody here know what that is? Yeah, Jane knows. Sound Girls is a international collective of engineers addressing the gender gap in audio. So they're a really great resource. It's essentially like, I met Swan off Sound Girls, which was funny. So then I knew 2 Sound Girls in Vancouver. And then from there, we started doing little workshop stuff. And I've had the opportunity to go to LA and New York and over to Germany and Portland just to meet all these people and see that the world is bigger than Vancouver. And that there's a lot of people who want to help and they're very nice. And if you want to go to Europe, there's the Women Live Music Europe. And yeah, there's a lot of support, like technical and artist-wise, to go to conferences, crash on people's couches. If you're in, like, I don't know, Denmark and you forgot that you needed a power adapter because their power is different, there's a sound girl who can hook you up with the thing. So yeah, just gonna mention those resources. And then I know, I think through the Sound Girls thing at some point I met Jane, and Jane's just done a whole bunch of phenomenal things, which is yeah, and seeing more and more stuff like this is great.
Yes. Lola is putting all the links to these resources in the chat, by the way, for everybody. So if you're not seeing that, you can go ahead and reference that for a lot of the things that Alexis just mentioned. Thank you. That was incredible. And let's sort of take something that you just said, and we'll get back to the artist-producer relationship. But she was saying that it's hard to sort of switch from to take the leap to engineer. Is there anything that you can do on that?
The leap from assistant to engineer is a tough jump to make, and to get to a point where it's viable as a career. Yeah, just
what do you think, Jane? Do you have anything that you can?
I would say that that's certainly true when you're talking about recording an orchestra or the complexity of situations that you engage with live, and more traditional engineering in like a big studio like Afterlife or Monarch, when you've got a huge amount of gear. And it's important, I think, that women and non-binary folks are offered opportunities into those roles, and it is challenging to get the hands-on experience. So it's great that yourself and Sound Girls and all of those opportunities are available. But in a hopeful sense, I think that, you know, it's jokingly talking about us becoming cyborgs and our relationship with technology, and, you know, the fact that we all carry our phone around the whole time. We willfully microchip ourselves. You know, in this interesting way. There are some positives to that as well. The accessibility of technology, the fact that when I was 14 and we recorded on this, you know, giant contraption with a cassette in it to do a 4-track thing, but now you can run GarageBand on your phone. Obviously, it's very different to the complexity of an orchestra. But I do think there's room for a lot more in the music industry now, and the kind of online content that's being built, and some of the more pop and hip hop productions are happening just on computers and like in simple environments in bedrooms. And that's very different to taking on you know, all of the exciting stuff that Alexis and Swan and folks that have been in live have been doing for years. And there's still really great opportunities for stuff like that. And obviously going to school for that stuff is a really great thing sometimes, because you can get your hands on equipment, because studios of that caliber are, you know, $600-700 a day, so you can't exactly just jump in and start experimenting. But I do think that there are these kind of hybrid environments now where you can go to beat making workshops, or, you know, do aspects of engineering and have these great experiences learning to engineer in like a practical, simple sense of doing someone's vocal tracking without having know how to mic up a drum kit yet. And to remind everyone and myself that we're so much stronger collectively in these scenarios. If you don't really know how to mic up that drum kit, then maybe those days happen in a big studio, but you do the rest like in this hybrid format at home, where you rent a good microphone from L&M and you're confident enough to track and edit the vocals, and you find these clever ways of working. And I think that's totally a product of where we're at with technology now. That's extremely exciting. I've got a few young people I work with that make their entire tracks on iPads, and ironically, a lot of my job is to add more dirt into it. It's like so perfectly digital that I then simulate all of those machines that are in the bigger studios, and I'm adding like sound to things and trying to make it sound like vinyl. And we simulate these old machines because they produce a certain aesthetic or a feeling of a vibe of an era, and people want that. So part of your knowledge now is like, either you're hands-on and you understand, you know, those older machines, how they've evolved into incredible things like digital desks, which you know, are their own crazy thing. Alexis knows that the whole industry went through a big change of, you know, moving from analog desks to people also mixing on iPads and operating digital desks with analog components in them. And then, yeah, interestingly enough, even though we all have access to computers, iPhones, iPads, we still, even though we can get these clean digital results, miss the aesthetic of these older machines. So there's all of these things that simulate these sounds and feelings of these things when we're not even using them. And it's kind of endless. And I find that inspiring, not overwhelming on a good day. and mostly because there's incredible things now. Like if you do happen to pay like $300 or whatever it is to get Logic on your laptop, and then you maybe subscribe to Plugin Alliance, which is a small monthly subscription, you've got this incredible library of sounds and ways of working at your fingertips in ways that were never possible before. And as self-produced artists, I mean, I think that's a really valuable tool for self-produced artists. It's a little bit different to someone that wants to become a front of house person for the Foo Fighters. And I don't know what everyone's aspirations are in the group, so I'm happy to kind of speak to that in any regard. But I don't know, am I answering this kind of question? I guess there's so many different aspects to music production, but it is more accessible than ever in a basic format. But getting your hands onto that more expensive gear, it's good to have partnerships or people to support you to do that.
Yeah, no, that makes a world of sense. And I mean, we have to also recognize that there are all of those different elements of, you know, engineering work. Like there is front of house work, there is, you know, live sound, there is all of this kind of stuff. So I think like any, I can only speak from a performer perspective, you know, I have to have my fingers in many pots in order to stay afloat. I can't just be one thing. And, you know, you have to sort of like kind of be the most diverse, versatile, like whatever, in order to, and in a beautifully, like perfectly curated for yourself kind of a way, but you got to sort of have irons in many irons in the fire in order to, you know, keep things sustainable as an artist, as a creative, I'd say.
And I remember what you said just before, and I just giving you all an update. I got worked. Thanks, baby. Sorry to interrupt, from my girlfriend, because it's pretty horrible when your car dies on the ferry, because if you don't start it up, you just go back and forwards and everyone's angry at you. So I had that. So thanks for that. I now recall the question that you asked before that happened.
No worries. I was going to just react. So all good.
Go check out Jodie's music. She forgets to turn the lights off. So you were asking me before that occurred a little bit about the producer relationship, and I want to go back to that because the technological arrangement and like it's endless, the gear, and it's kind of candy, like all of the way that it's marketed, all of the plugins and the equipment. It's kind of, honestly, it's marketed a bit like pornography to men. It's like, oh, you got to get this thing, and it's like the way that you look through it all and the way that people talk about it. It's not really built for women and non-binary folks for the most part. Even the names of things, you know, you've got Little Altar Boy, you know, it used to be called Gear Sluts, the major site to learn about music technology, until they just changed that last year. So, like, what's that, Alexis?
Sound Girls petitioned them and they finally changed it. They put so much pressure on them for that. And also for all of the manufacturers to up their game and actually hire more women and to feature them in their ads. And you can see that with like the Digico campaign. We're like, hey, look, people who actually use these boards instead of just having a model who doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah, exactly. So there have been some really good progressive changes in terms of that technology, and things becoming more accessible just on the laptop takes it out of it always, every single item costing $7,000 and being so, you know, inaccessible. So that's a cool progression. However, what links those things in a positive way, I think, for self-produced artists, especially locally with some of the different personalities and folks we have in town, is someone to help guide you through that process. You know, whether it's Producers Lounge, Sound Girls programs, some other things that you can get into to expand your skills. And honestly, if you're self-motivated, there's so many things online that you can do, whether it's a short Berkeley course in synthesis or in home recording. If you're really self-motivated, you kind of can just get yourself rolling in a way that was never possible before, which is great. However, if you're wanting someone to like bring the best out of you in an artist, if you're seeking a producer, not an engineer, I want to go through some of the distinctions there. I mean, a really great engineer is often a little bit of a producer as well, because they're going to support you. This is like if you go into a space to work with someone, or if you're doing it on a budget and you're working in someone's home, it could be bedroom, it could be here, it could be in a bigger space. But I believe what an artist is looking for, and I think it's why I've been lucky enough to have enough production clients to be a music producer in a world where it's very difficult to make a living out of music, is like, if I'm honest, I only work on projects that I truly believe in. So I won't take on things if I don't think I can get a good result for the client. And that should go both ways. If you don't like someone's personality that's going to produce you, I think they're not treating you well, or they think that you need to sound all of these different ways and it doesn't resonate with you in any way, it's probably not a good fit. You want someone who's supporting your creative vision, who makes you feel inspired about using technology, not intimidated by it, is happy to get your hands on it. Like when I have artists work with me and they've only ever played kind of guitar and sung before and they want to make something different, then I'll pull out synthesizers and I'll be like, okay, try with this knob, let's do this here, and we'll do like huge components of expanding the creative sonic palette together so that it's not just something that I'm doing to their track, and everyone's got a different way of working, obviously, as a producer, but I would say some of the best albums that I've made over the years are with artists that I've known for many years, and I like love them deeply. I'm willing to go the extra mile to spend that time to make sure when they finally ask me as a friend to make sure I do a better job than any other producer that's made their work before, to be like deeply engaged in it because of knowing part of their life story. Now, that's a big ask if you just walk into a random studio and there's like some dude engineer there who's like got no idea about what your music is about or anything about you. But maybe we're in an era now where it's actually better to have someone, whether it's a vocal coach or a producer or someone that really supports your vision and makes you feel good about what you're doing. So when you hit record, you feel so good about it, you're capturing the good vibrations rather than like struggling to get something out. And part of that is artist responsibility as well, is knowing when you're actually ready, when you've got a full batch of songs ready, and you can maybe, this is a great tip, and I, with all of my artists, I say this, have reference tracks of things you want to sound like. Some people are like, no, it's original, I don't sound like anyone. I call bullshit on that, because we are such mirrors of eras, of technology, of each other. Like music is the vibrational way that we communicate with each other about who we are, about an aesthetic of what we're into. Like say Krystle wants something to sound like 70s and disco and funky, she's into soul stuff. It's like, I'm going to want to hear which artists have excited her the most in order to ensure that I record drums in the way that's going to reflect back that thing that feels good, that is important to her. And that could be not the whole track, it could just be the snare sound. And this is where, like, without even being a full-on producer or musician, like even if you're just a singer-songwriter and he has a couple chords, I'm sure you've got a big music library that you listen to and stuff that you love. And if you can walk in, maybe without the technical language to describe that to a producer, but be like, oh, I really like these tones and these tones, could you imagine this working in this song? Then you've instantly got a voice without really having to, spend 10 years researching what all of the machines were that did that. Because if you've got a good producer, they should be able to deduce, right, that was the snare recorded in this era, it was probably this compressor, and it was this, and that was probably a steel snare drum. And then you make sure, the producer makes sure you get a drummer that's going to produce those results. So that's like a really great simple way that you can get involved in the process without having to be super technical. And I appreciate that so much when artists are organized like that and they have a clear vision. And then it's also okay if they don't, if they're just a great songwriter and they come to me and I'm like showing them material and sounds maybe of what records I've worked on, or things that I could imagine working for them depending on their own goals and aspirations. Folks that want to have their music placed in sync and television, sadly, super cutthroat world. Like it's very like stuff that references America a lot, pop stuff that's going to go unnoticed in the background is the majority of sync. People want like a bar band, they want 80s music. My agency represents all these diverse artists. We don't get that many placements. I was ambitious. My taste in music is a little bit too diverse for the majority of well-paying US television placements, right? But if an artist really wants that, I can be like, cool, Mary Jane Hi-Fi can do a remix of your acoustic track that's going to give it elements that could make it more likely to get a placement if that's one of your aspirations. And don't forget, when you write a song, it could appear in so many different ways. You just think of like people covering songs, but even the way that you present your own track could be rearranged or produced in any genre, really, if you've got someone or found someone talented to work with. At the upper echelon of working with producers and mixers, people charge crazy amounts of money. Like this is beyond what we're doing in this city, but sometimes it's $25,000 to get one track mixed in Los Angeles, right? And I know that that's not kind of what we're talking about right now in this context in this meeting. And luckily, thanks to funding, you can still get mid-level producers to work for you in the city that have a lot of experience and, you know, have that supplemented, and you might end up with a better result than if you kind of just go in, book a studio for one day with only an engineer without someone helping you sculpt your creative vision. If you don't have a lot of experience in that regard, I do think that there's like a huge value in a producer, but sometimes that producer can be hidden in a best friend that's a really great singer that's already made a bunch of records themselves, supporting you to bring your vision to life. And, you know, the clearer idea you have of what you want, the better result you're probably going to get, unless you're all about experimentation and you're like, I've just got this one wacky screamy vocal and I kind of like Nirvana, like let's make some feedback sounds out of this guitar and just like see where we can go. Okay, it can kind of go either way, but generally having your material ready to the point that you're not that you can perform it fairly effortlessly in the studio is important. You pay a lot of money for a studio and then you don't really have your ability to sing the vocals on pitch in the space, and your producer spends most of the time on your vocal production. That does happen because vocal production is probably the most important component, but the more ready you can be if you do have a singing coach, so that when you come in, you're just feeling good about what you're doing. Great. Also, if you haven't really had much experience singing in the studio, sometimes it can be difficult. And then it is important to have someone that you feel comfortable there as your producer coaching you through, rather than like a stern engineer being like, no, shit. Like, you don't want to end up in that situation. And this city's pretty good for it. A lot of people that run the studios are very talented and very open and passionate and do have engineers in them that will support you. But if you're going to do your project over a longer period of time and use multiple spaces and do the hybrid of some of it at home, the bed tracks in a bigger space, I do recommend having a producer to guide you through that, because someone's got to sew all of that together and make it make sense. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to unmute myself and comment on that. I have a couple of things that I'd like to sort of ask or interject as well. Do you think that it is appropriate or not to have more than one producer on a project? Like, is having multiple producers a benefit? Is it a negative, or is it sort of really dependent on the artist and their particular vision as to how they want? You know, my last record, I looked for one producer, and I actually kind of respected. I was a little offended at first, but I respected in the end that he said, I only want to do these 2 tracks of yours. And then I found someone else and they did the rest. So I think that it can be really interesting. And I'd love to hear your opinion on whether or not, you know, like, and I just want to more, celebrate and comment on the fact that relationships really are everything, especially in a creative mode, because you have to feel safe when you're putting out, you know, this very, very vulnerable part of you. And another thing I wanted to comment on was I thought it was really cool that you really highlighted the point that it doesn't have to be for one outcome. It doesn't have to just be like for your record or for a single. You can be making a song with purpose of maybe getting a placement on TV, and then have that as your sort of driving purpose to get something done. And I think that can be so much more versatile for a career, rather than just being like, put all your eggs in one artist basket and you know, again, and like you mentioned before, like, and then have my name in lights and be on, you know, be on billboards and such. So I think there's just so much more that you can be asking for as an artist, to then ask the producer as the relationship as you're building it. But what was the first thing that I said?
Well, you were talking about the producer and having multiple producers. So let's take a step back here, because definition of producer can be very multifaceted. Like, obviously there's a producer in film, there's an event producer, and then in music it can mean a producer who's an engineer and an arranger, and a producer who can like do the lot, which is something that I can offer. I play instruments and arrange as well as producing. But some people that are a producer, more like someone like Rick Rubin, who's a vibe setter, who in the early days of the Beastie Boys like did make a whole bunch of the drum beats, but now I don't know if anyone follows him. He's made a lot of great records over the years, but he barely touches any equipment, but he sets a vibe, and obviously you have to have quite a big budget to just have a vibe setter at the top of it. But it's important to kind of note, even when you're seeking a producer locally or when you're talking about multiple producers, I'd say there's definitely scope to have multiple producers in like hip hop and pop genres. Like if you look at all of the biggest hits in, you know, in the States at the moment, there could be up to like 10 or 12 producers, especially in a lot of hip hop. And what that means, the producer in that context, it might just mean that they made a beat, you know. So because producer, like in hip hop more specifically, often means the beat maker as opposed to the rapper. In this sort of context of producer engineer, you want to make sure if you're employing multiple people in that regard on a record that it's very clear who's doing what, so that you don't have issues of control with producers kind of being like, I thought that I was deciding the sonic landscape for this. So doing it per track is often a good idea, but then you still want to make sure it's going to have a cohesive sound. Maybe if it's an album, maybe that doesn't matter if it's singles. I also like hearing that, you know, you had someone that only wanted to make a couple of tracks because they were probably really clear that they could do a good job of those tracks. And then maybe we're like, I'm not so sure about the rest of it. And that's okay, because you don't want someone kind of making material that they're not super passionate about. Sometimes budget restraints might be like, I'm going to produce this single with this whiz bang person for more money, and then I'm going to make a bunch of other material that's not produced by them, and then you can see the result at the end and be like, should I still release that other material or just the one whiz bang track? And that really comes down to like why you're making your music and what you're doing. If you have really commercial aspirations, then your goals are going to be very different to if you're storytelling, expressing, making a record of for yourself and your community and your friends. They are different worlds. And, you know, even if you do have bright light aspirations, it's a crazy world out there and anything can happen. But like, I would say like making music from the heart, because it makes you feel good with a group of people that you love in the band and a producer that you trust and makes you feel good, it's probably going to serve you better in the end than having like this pie in the sky idea of what's possible. And it's like a very tiny number of tracks that kind of make it to that position. So the more true to yourself you can be, and if you can find a producer that is like able to create the space where you can be comfortable and be yourself and ask questions and, you know, feel confident and not like they're making fun of you in any way. If you have a technical question, someone that's like, yes, let's try that, that's possible, rather than like, that's a terrible idea. You don't want someone that's shouting down those ideas even at the outset. And so I recommend, like, if you're thinking about working with someone, throwing around some of your musical references as well as sending them a few demos. Like I always ask clients to send me iPhone recordings of the tracks and then a playlist of other material that they like and what they would imagine, you know, the songs becoming. And if a producer doesn't really ask you that, I mean, obviously it's different to if you're just hiring a studio, because they don't have to give you any extra time. Like I do charge an additional producer fee on top of the studio rent fee, and that's how I have the many minutes to have those conversations. If, you know, artists are having feelings and we're going through a pre-production phase, and like I kind of offer more of an executive producer scenario where I can also try and create pathways for them into sync and things like that. Not every producer works like that, and that's where it comes down to these definitions of producer. Producer might just mean beat maker. Producer might mean, you know, the person that's going to be your singing coach, but you've got a couple of engineers sitting there doing all of that engineering work and someone separate mixing. It really usually just comes down to budget, and the bigger the budget, the bigger the team. There's a number of really good all-in-one women producers in this city though, like what Lynn Gardner does over on the Sunshine Coast at her Soundgarden retreat is incredible. She's been an engineer like since, I don't know, the 90s in London, and she's got a great sort of homestay space where she'll produce, arrange with you, be a co-writer if you want that, as well as record. I offer all of those similar types of things to Lynn, where it's pretty hands-on and across the board. And you've got folks like Olivia Kwan, who is at Monarch, who's incredible, and she's in her early 20s, and she considers herself an engineer, but you're kind of getting like a bonus engineer mixer producer because she's just so damn good, even though that she's
amazing. Yeah, she did the last record I worked on. She's fantastic.
Exactly. And if you're lucky enough to walk in with an engineer like that, then you're kind of golden in studio scenarios. And I do recommend working at Monarch, and obviously Capsule here as well. We're accommodating in those ways. But, you know, working in any of the bigger spaces in town, like if you rent warehouse, say, Annie's an amazing assistant engineer there, but she's probably not going to give the overarching vision for your project. You're probably going to want to have like Sylvia Massey, no, I don't know, someone come into that role and help make the microphone choices in that room, because they've got millions of dollars of gear. And if you're not experienced enough to know and, you know, help an assistant engineer set up. I mean, Annie is actually also just like Olivia. I'm listening to myself saying this and I'm like, no, actually there's lots of really talented women who can do it all in these studios in town, but it's not always the case with who's operating. And sometimes you just have to be careful around being overly ambitious of renting a big room with a whole bunch of gear if you don't have someone experienced enough to get the most out of that gear, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, makes a world of sense. Absolutely. We've got a question here from someone. Let me just go back and see. It was if someone is trying to try their hand at home recording, how can you tell that it sounds high quality?
That's a good question, because I mean, all music is subjective. If you've got anyone who has a little more experience than you that you're able to kind of talk and file share with, that's a great starting point. Reference tracks are a really good idea, but you know, when you first begin recording on your setup at home, you're going to be miles ahead of the 90s 4-track tape machine that we started with, just because of the pure accessible fidelity of modern digital recording. I would say that it's very difficult to tell the quality of your own material objectively, whether you've recorded it or someone else has anyway, sometimes, because we're so sort of inside our own creative process that can be challenging. But I would say that, you know, mixing stuff, working on it, and then taking it out of your listening environment where you've created it on headphones at home and putting it in your car and listening to it alongside other tracks will tell you a lot about what the material is sounding like. And beyond the first stages of just sort of setting up a mic and doing things, there's two very distinct things that happen with the home setup. And I'm going to focus a little more on the home setup than the bigger studio sort of concept. I feel like we've talked about that a lot, and just making sure you take care of yourself in those more expensive environments and make sure you choose really good people if you're investing on that level. Whereas on a more accessible, you know, home studio hybrid level, which honestly I work on too. Like I've got this space here and I've got a setup at my house, and there's a comfort that can happen from not feeling like you're on the clock for crazy money all the time, especially for the aspects of your project that don't need it, which is why we built this space, because I realized, oh, drums, bass, strings, 2 or 3 days, and then 15 days to do all of the editing, mixing, vocals, which can happen in a smaller space. And you can also consider that with your own spaces at home, like a majority of the stuff that you want to do could happen at home. Maybe it could all happen at home if you're using MIDI instruments. Now, going back to the question, in this funny cyborg state of like some organic instruments and a lot of sampled instruments, which, you know, you can access now on sites like Splice. So when people are looking, like lots of links being shared there, where you can put together material. You have to remember, when you're using sample-based music, obviously it's important, if you want to eventually be in sync and television or have those opportunities, that you use cleared samples, so that you're not, you know, accidentally putting Michael Jackson hooks in your songs. I mean, no one really wants to do that now anyway, but but that you have material that you've cleared. Now, this material that you buy, whether it's on Splice, whether it's the loops that live within GarageBand and Logic, it's already been polished and compressed to sound incredible. So that snare sound that you put a sample of in MIDI is probably going to sound better than if you are a beginning engineer and you put a microphone in front of a snare drum and hit it. The sample's probably going to sound better because it's been worked on, packaged, you know, and that's a real benefit of being able to make in your own home studio environment now, is that you're working with these pretty incredible you know, virtual instruments, or, you know, between synthesizers and those samples, all of that's going to sound great. Now, when you suddenly put an organic acoustic guitar or your voice alongside that, if it's not affected in any way, sometimes it's confronting. It's like, whoa, why do those samples sound so polished, and why does this sound so raw? You know, it's because there's differences in those textures. Obviously, there's the microphone that you're using, and these things have an influence. And when you do rent a big studio and the microphone's worth a ton and it goes through all of this equipment behind me, yes, it produces a result. But also, if you're a great singer and you have a reasonably good condenser microphone that's, you know, worth at least $300-400, and you do a good job of the vocal, and then you work out how to use a little bit of compression, even if it's just a preset in Logic that's female vocal, boom, and you end up with a bit of a vocal chain, that's going to bump up your organic recording to meet those samples in a way that it makes sense rather than just the raw sound of your voice. This is for folks that are playing with kind of beat making and more programmed aspect in their music. Doesn't mean that it can't be organic or folky as well, but you're kind of wanting to meet that relationship of all of these samples that have already been like treated to sound like whiz bang, and then, you know, the sweetness of you know, of your organicness as a singer or guitar player. Like, how do you match that, you know, with the guitar as well? Recording acoustic guitar, lifelong practice of learning how to do that well, just like the drums. And, you know, DIing it will get you a quick result, but if you put a nice condenser microphone in the right position in front of an acoustic guitar, you're going to do a better job. Do a little bit of research on how to do that if you're excited about that. Have a shot at it. And then again, consider, you know, at the beginning, if you don't have the knowledge, using some presets to bring that volume of that guitar up, especially if you're matching it with the samples. And these are broad concepts. These aren't across the board things that, you know, one has to do. But if you're kind of feeling like you're working on stuff and there's those gaps between what you're recording and the stuff that you're programming, that's a little bit why, because that stuff that you're kind of throwing in there, the virtual instruments, has already been hugely processed. And so there's doing that to all individual tracks. And then there's things that you do to like the master, which is like the final channel, the master bus. And obviously mastering is its whole own mysterious, amazing science. And Elisa Peng Sayang does an incredible job of that locally. But there's little ways that you can do it well and badly on your own equipment by just using limiters to bring it up. Because often you'll find you record something and you go listen to it in the car next to all of this other stuff. It's like, oh, it's so quiet. And that's because mastering is important step of the recording. And there's all these sort of AI technologies where you can send your song off and get it done online with, you know, computers will will maximize your song, you know, and help you with that. But you know, that's an experimental kind of thing and it works to a degree, but obviously the human touch is going to give you better results. Now, it's not to say that if your track within itself, not next to all of those other tracks, if it sounds beautiful and you enjoy it, but it still doesn't have the loudness of the other tracks, it doesn't really matter, because you could take it to master and do that. You're thinking more about your mix and the relationship of the instruments and having a good experience. You know, you've always got the volume control to be able to crank it up a little bit more to match those other tracks while you're doing that explorative listening. In terms of whether it sounds good, that is very subjective. Like we just all have different opinions about what aesthetics appeal to us. If it sounds good to you and you feel like you're getting the result that you want and it makes you feel good, then you've probably done a great job. There's probably always still more to explore and how you could polish that though. So taking those demos, if you're doing those, if you do want to take the next step, taking those demos to a producer or to the next level, you're going to have a better way of expressing to the producer what you want if you've already done those early steps. Even if you're like, hey, I made this, but ooh, the guitar sounds bad. What could I do with that? Or if we're going to re-record that, how could we address that? I mean, knowledge is power, and the more risks you take and the more you explore the endless possibilities that are out there now and accessible technology to make things, the more you're going to learn. It's a win-win situation.
Yeah. I have a collaboration type question. So like if somebody is recording something at home and they come up with just like to me, an amazing vocal take is sometimes a one-off and it'll never happen again. And, you know, I really like, if you capture that at home or if you have that from say another studio or something, can you bring that to a producer and say, can you help me with this? Like, can we, you know, sort of save this and add to it? Or is it always having to sort of re-record? Can you kind of do that type of middle ground collaboration?
Depending on what your producer is willing to do, you know?
Yeah.
I do that all the time, like especially now in the time of pandemic, we're always sending stems back and forth. Stems is a word that can mean many things. It can mean an output of all audio tracks in a session, or it could mean things grouped like drums, bass, all vocals. And you know, when I send stuff to Mary, I'll often bounce stems so she can have drums, bass, instruments. So when she's tracking her stuff, she can make a choice. Now that's similar to what you're talking about in that using components of things that have been captured elsewhere to create things, or having things begun and completed elsewhere. It's pretty common. For me, at least, it's common. A bunch of the male stuff, we kind of used elements of things that people had recorded at home combined with things that we created here. it comes down to the genre and the style and the quality of things. And if you've also got a good producer who's like, that's really great, but the quality's a little bit compromised in that home recording, maybe we should redo that part, then they're probably going to be telling you that for a reason. But it's not to say that you won't have sped up the process by offering like an awesome guide vocal track so that everyone else could like quickly get their instrumental parts done in the studio, even if you're going to lose that later. So I personally don't see any issue with like adding multiple elements from different places. Now, something when you're starting out though is difficult if you're using a different DAW, digital audio workstation, like someone's using Logic, someone's using GarageBand. It's the importance of knowing how to export stems, like I was saying, which could be as simple as like soloing the vocal and doing just a bounce of the vocal only if the vocal is what you want to keep. And if you're working with people on multiple platforms, making sure you know what the BPM is, so the beats per minute, and putting that in the file title and always bouncing from 0 with the BPM in the file title, then you can share with anyone, whatever they're using. It's a simple secret, like rather than being like, oh, I don't know, I've got Logic and there's these bits. It's like making sure you send a consolidated audio file of a single track of something bounced from 0, then anyone can open it up in any format, you know. And then you do have the choice of whether that's going to be wet or dry, which means effects, no effects, or printing that separately. These are all things that it's good to get used to the idea of that, because it takes it out of the complexity of like a zillion plugins and this format and all of the kind of extrapolating. If you've made a big crazy file in your own digital audio workstation and you can't open it up somewhere else, then it's no use. But if you know how to get your audio out of there in a functional way, then you can share it with producers, with other studios, you know, easily. And it's not rocket science what I'm talking about now. Like if you go online, you can be like, how do I bounce out a single file? I'll just type it into Google and it'll tell you how to do that. And that kind of takes away a lot of the challenges of people having different technology in different spaces and allows that collaborative recording building to occur.
I love that, because I feel like it kind of takes it from either being home or, you know, big budget studio. It kind of gives like this middle ground that I personally like haven't felt the opportunity to share. I mean, I have a lot of collaborative opportunities personally, and I can't speak for everybody, but I think sometimes it feels like it's either at home or it's like a big $750 a day studio. So it's cool to know that there's collaborative opportunities that can kind of bring you to a middle ground and allow you to sort of flex your creativity as well as have the expertise of someone who can help you
Totally
smooth things out, right? Got another question that was about vocal capture. How do you get a nice crispy sounding lead vocal using Caitlin is using a Rode NT2-A?
Cool. So whether it's a Rode mic or just another nice condenser microphone, there's many elements involved, you know, depending on whether you have a preamp or you're just going directly into the interface of your computer. There's components in the capture that can influence that. But generally on a basic home setup, we're just recording into the interface. As long as you get a good clean capture and use a pop filter on a reasonable condenser, your treatment is probably going to happen afterwards with plugins. Whereas in a bigger space, it might go through a preamp and compression on the way in. You're doing cleanup in a way. I mean, things like mic position and mic technique are so often overlooked. Everyone gets all fussed about compressing and squashing things a lot, whereas I spend a lot of time with artists in here just being really focused on get up on the grill for the whispery bits, come back. You'd be surprised how much you can make a recording sound better the more intimately you engage with the track and where it's at and what you're recording. So quiet things closer to the microphone, moving back in the room when you're in a louder belting bit, but not so far in the room that you can hear the whole room around you in the condenser, like knowing kind of that this is a good max distance usually for most condenser microphones, or you're going to hear the broader space. There is no one way to guarantee a good crisp vocal. I mean, obviously a great performance is the most important element, and then that microphone you're using is totally an industry standard mic. So that and any combination of compression and reverb and delay and stuff that you might want to experiment with post, which means afterwards if you're working on a computer setup, because often you can't run plugins in real time on your basic computer setup unless you're using UAD stuff. I don't know how many people use Universal Audio stuff, but they have processing that allows you to run analog like elements in real time. So you can record with these digital versions of the analog equipment on the way in. Now, not everyone has that. So often you'll be singing dry and then adding your elements afterwards in a home setup. And I would go, if you're really into it, like go and watch some videos about vocal chains online, even if you don't have all of the different plugins that they talk about. Learn a little bit about what a couple of different compressors do, what you can do with delay as opposed to only using reverb is kind of mind-blowing once you get into it. Reverb alone will make you sound, you know, like you're in a beautiful room, and it can work, but sometimes in more rhythmic music it's like, oh, the vocalist sounds like they're in a cave, but the drums are really present and close by, and delay is good for that because it ducks in and out. So like just learning a little bit more about those effects and how they can enhance what you're doing is good for that. Yeah, did that answer that question?
I think it answered for me, but hopefully, Caitlin, you got some good stuff there. From Nasia wants to know what are some good ways to find and connect with producers around. We've gotten some answers in the chat for her, but is there sort of a directory? Can we make a directory? There is a women in music sort of directory that's happening in, you know, the world right now that we can all you know, like sign up to, but I think also it's really nice to have, you know, perhaps some recommendations. Is there a way that you know, think that we can find some good resources?
Yeah, there's different. So there's the National Arts Centre here have an international women's producers group that shows a bunch of Canadian, Scandinavian, Australian. I'm still in the Australian bit. I'm like, come on, I've been here for years. But like, there's an incredible directory of folks that are out and working in the industry. Locally, connecting with Producers Lounge and telling us a little bit about what your hopes are for your producer. We can connect you with any of the women and non-binary folks working locally, of which if I was to go through folks locally and recommend for you to work locally for obvious budget reasons, unless you've got specific reasons to go to Toronto or LA, you're also in a great position to get funding if you keep it within the province, as we're all kind of recovering from the pandemic. There is more money if you keep projects local. So there's folks like Elisa Pangsayang, Olivia Kwan, Ray Spoon is amazing, who isn't in the city but is in the province, and Lynn. And then you've got folks like Mary, who has worked as a MD for people for a long time, who's doing production and arranging, and you know, she works on her own as well as we do projects together to support artists through things, very much in the hybrid environment that you were talking about, which I think is the modern and cool way to go about things in the city, because you can get that big room, but just for the key elements that you need. And then that allows you to budget a little more to be able to do it in smaller spaces like this, or home spaces, or guide parts of the work yourself. Like maybe you're a beat maker making tracks and you've got the mix and all of the vocals done, and you just need someone to put some special sauce on the mix. And maybe you only need to pay for the mix if you've kind of already got your tracks edited and into great shape on your home setup, depending on what you're building. As far as a directory, it kind of ebbs and flows. And the challenge of that is finding experienced producers and aspiring producers. If you just have a list, it's a little bit difficult to know unless you do a bit of research on folks' background. And then you might kind of want an aspiring producer because they might be more financially accessible to you, and they might be building their catalog in a way that they're excited to work with you for a bit less, but they have a bit more experience than you do. And that can be a great mentorship opportunity. In that case, it does come down to budget a little bit when you're choosing who you're producing with. Usually, I mean, all of these things are like this in the music industry. However, you know, segueing into some of the other stuff we're going to talk about, there's more money available now than before the pandemic for people to be creating works. There's more support for women-led projects and having women in production roles, and non-binary folks than ever before. So you're probably going to be helping your grant application by, you know, talking about empowerment and, you know, putting women in those roles that have traditionally, you know, been held by men for a long time. And locally, there are a lot of experienced women and non-binary folks who can support you in that. Producers Lounge has a community page, which is a little inactive at the moment, but as we begin this Elevate programming we're doing, at the end of the month, there's going to be active user groups for discussions about, people's works, and different up and coming producers being able to have discussions with their peers. So not so much, you viewing yourself only as artist, maybe you're viewing yourself more as a self-produced artist, speaking with other self-produced artists or producers, where you're information sharing rather. And that can be kind of a cool way to look at it if you're not in the later stages of the project, so that you can continue to work and, sculpt and shine up your ideas before you're ready to invest in working with someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the money. Can we talk about that money? So I personally love me a grant, and I'll tell you why. Not just for money. Even an unsuccessful grant puts you in a place of, alignment with your vision. It narrows down your ideas. It gets you to the simmering point, and then you can, really start putting in the good ingredients, right? And I think that no matter what, it's the best learning and organizational thing for myself. And I almost think an unsuccessful grant helps you more with learning than the successful ones do, at least in the beginning stages. Tell us about how Producers Lounge works with grants, how you guys are funded. You don't have to be very specific about those kind of things, but
Okay.
But what are your tips for really leveraging? And right now, it's changed so much. If you look at a grant application from 5 years ago and a grant application now, it's just insane the kind of details that you can put in there, and that will help you get ahead of the traditional pack that were originally kind of always celebrated financially with grants. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very exciting time in that regard. And I've, been lucky enough to move to BC in this time where there is a lot of change being affected by powerful women at the top in Creative BC and Music BC circles. It's also been encouraged by folks like, well, many folks within the industry, but, DJ Osho, who I collaborate with a lot, and myself and a few people were very much encouraging of getting more specificity. I mean, it's kind of gone to the nth degree in terms of how many little details about one's background, we fill these days on grants. But it's awesome because there's like the most diverse projects coming out of this city that have ever happened. I'll backtrack a little because I see on the side someone was asking how Producers Lounge is funded, which I'm totally happy to answer, but I think that's quite different to getting artist funding for an album. So let's go through it a little bit. So the key to writing really amazing, successful grants is to make sure that you're applying to the right organization and the right program, and it's a good fit for the project. Your chances are much better if you're already super eligible and within the bounds of what they're wanting, and you're not fiction writing to try and make something fit something that's, not really a great fit. Now, when you're looking for music business grants, like in the case of Producers Lounge, Capsule Studios applies for that. We're the presenting organization, and it's quite formal, and that grant application involves overarching data that we've collected over 3 years on 400 people in the province, and there's all sorts of language around long-term goals to increase the number of women and non-binary folks working in music production in BC. I was aware when I moved to Canada of some stuff that I read in the federal arts guidelines that they were going to make all funding 50-50 by 2024 between men and women. Obviously, that's them leaving out non-binary folks in that at that time because the language hadn't evolved to be more mindful of that at the time. And as someone that's historically received quite a lot of government funding to run programs for Indigenous groups in Australia, I was good and ready to go with that type of formalized funding when moving here. It's important, whether it's a not-for-profit organization or a private business, when you're engaged in a music business type grant, that use very formal language. And at this stage, really think about your community engagement and the different ways that you can guarantee that you're being inclusive of all folks and that you're going to make the community at large a better place through your funding. Any way that you can list partner organizations like us. Next year we'll be saying that we're partner organizations, you know, in those funding things going forward. Finding your sister organizations if it's women's-based projects. Super important, and really making sure you've done your research and that you know all of your competitors, even though I don't like that word, but the other folks that are offering similar things locally, to make sure you're not repeating something that already exists, that you're working hand in hand with folks to make sure, you know, you're a great fit for the community and that you can enhance things without taking work from other people, that your ideas are new. And in those type of grants, your language is formal. You're not writing I, you're not writing we, you're talking about Producers Lounge is. You're always going to be talking in a third sort of person context, using quite formal language to ensure the organization that you've done a great deal of research and that there's going to be huge results on a large scale. That is very different to what probably most of y'all are interested in, which is career development style grants, which is one of the ones offered by Creative BC. There's also City of Vancouver grants, the demo program, that are really fantastic for early makers of music. It is geared towards the BIPOC community, that particular grant, and also the LGBTQIA2S community. But there's those grants, there's BC Arts grants, there's Canada Council grants, and they all kind of have a different flavor in the way that the language works. The best news is, beyond me just talking about it with you today, there are great resources and support from those organizations if you want to apply, where you can go to a specialized session where you should do your best to have your summary and your project in the state where you can communicate what it is really clearly to the person that's going to be assisting you. And then you can get their feedback on what that particular organization is hoping to see. For Creative BC, lately since the pandemic, it's local content, engaging more local folks and studios to make sure our economy is going to work in that regard. It doesn't mean that you can't involve folks from Toronto and LA, because I also like the prestige of different people coming into the province. But there's a big focus on that even within artist projects, to like support local studios and producers. Having a broad team with some people with experience or some emerging folks, it really does come down to the individualized grant. Again, the first statement that I said, knowing what the guidelines for that grant are, reading those really carefully, and then checking your objectives against those, and then being like, oh, is this a good fit? Or should I only apply for this component of the project with the grant? With your personal artist grants, it depends on the organization as to how much detail you'll have to go into. Surprisingly, Canada Council ones can sometimes be really simple and not involve as much text as some of the provincial grants, and they can be more personal and arts-based and less commerce-based. But I would also say that there's been a broad move away from having to prove stats, financial returns, etc. since the pandemic, because obviously globally we're in challenging times, but then especially the music industry, we're having no live performance. A lot of people don't have income. So it's been a really great time to be able to apply to do the wackiest creative projects you could ever think of, because you don't have to necessarily prove the financial outcomes at the other end like you used to. Now, if you're a beginning and emerging artist, Creative BC made some big changes this year where they decided they were going to fund a lot more first-time projects. And that's really great. And I think they're going to be continuing with that alongside supporting a lot of BIPOC artists, which is a great thing for this city, which has historically, had Bon Jovi and AC/DC and Bryan Adams' Dreams for a really long time, and that gets a little boring after a while. So finally, some really great stuff happening, like with Kensha in the role that she's in at Music BC alongside Lindsay and Jimmy. They're doing great work in helping, influence that change, as well as Brenda and all the folks at Creative BC. They've really made a huge effort to address those things, and a lot of the behind the scenes work is dialoguing about that to make sure that the city's soundscape changes to be more representative of the diverse voices here. So that's exciting for people of color. That's exciting for women. It's a great time to be making art. And it's also a great time to be getting support from those organizations. They actually will meet you privately to help you get a hold of that money. You know, there are those one-on-one mentorship opportunities. I would say to respect the folks that give you that time, the more organized and further along the process you can be with having your information organized when you go for those meetings. You're doing yourself a favor, and you know, you're respecting their time. And there's a lot of information out there in these grant applications as to what the guidelines are, what the questions are, also their point system. Go look at the scoring system and be like, am I hitting all of these points? Do I need to change my language in order to be more descriptive to prove that I'm meeting these targets? Grant writing is nothing like creative writing. It is, in a way, you can be creative in business, and there's elements of being creative because you might have to be creative to help, you know, yourself hit some of the points markers. But ultimately, it's persuasive writing. I don't know who enjoyed that kind of thing in high school, but you are persuasive writing. You face off. You're just like so convincing that this is the greatest thing that they've ever come across, and they should ultimately fund it because it's going to vastly benefit, you know, the artist as well as the community, as well as music at large. You know, it's kind of, yeah, it's a funny world, and it's important to speak confidently in grants, to say, you know, whatever the project is, the Jimi Hendrix Stratocaster project will meet its targets by, not hopes to. You're saying that it's happening. That's like the biggest tip in grant writing. You're writing about it as if it's definitely going forward with or without their money, like the grant body or agency is lucky to be involved, like they're an investor rather than someone that you're asking for money. It's like, oh, we've already got Coca-Cola on board, and we've got, this is happening if you're lucky. I mean, not too smart ass, but like you're kind of wanting them to feel like they're coming to a big party of something epic that's already occurring, you know?
That's the best tip that I've ever gotten. Convince them that this project is happening, whether they're a part of it or not. And at that point, then their money is just, you know, even if they're asking for entire funding from them, even if it's like 90% of the funding is from them, you're in 50% or whatever they're offering, you know, convince them that this is going to happen, whether you're part of it or not.
And an interesting point is they opened things up to allow sort of in-kind contributions in grants recently, which wasn't being done when I first moved here. Everything kind of had to be commercially funded. But at the moment, you know, if you've got a friend that's a graphic designer that can write you a letter as part of your thing saying, I'm donating $1,500 worth of my services for grants that allow in-kind stuff, that goes in your budget. So then it looks like you've got multiple investors, even if there's not a financial exchange. That's a really great way to show more broad support for your project. If you've got a few different ways that you can show in-kind, you usually can't show your own in-kind services. So I'm going to sing for free on this, but for any of those kind of supporting activities, that's a really great tip. That, as well as in the text of it, talking about partner organizations or relationships with other artists. So collabs, you know, if you've got multiple producers like we were talking about before, or collaboration if you've got session players that have, you know, a bigger name than you in the city and you can mention them. It is still a music industry. There's still smoke and mirrors, and there's still all of that, you know, that unfortunate side of things where, you know, if someone does have a higher profile name than you, it's probably going to be useful for you to mention their involvement in the project because it's going to stand out to the funders. If you do happen to have many thousands of streams, mention that.
That works. That helps. It does.
Yeah.
Shows that you have support, right? It shows that people are going to listen, and you'll get, you know, a transactional kind of element from your release or whatever. I'd like to, I think, open up the chat. Like if anybody wants to kind of raise your hand or whatever, and you want to ask Jane something, or, you know, if you want to add something to the conversation. We've had a lot of amazing convo going on in the chat box.
I'm not keeping very good track of that. So if anyone has
no, I am.
that I haven't answered.
Lola and I are watching it, so it's all good. But yeah, I just wanted to open this up to anybody who might have had a question that's not as easily, you know, sort of articulated through just a text and my relating it to you. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, normally at around this point, we would have like our breakout rooms so we could talk more intimately. So this is a different format. Kara wants to know, can you talk about more home studio setup for vocalists? Okay. Like, what do we need? Like, what are Like what's a
Yeah,
good
where's Cara? I can't quite, put your hand up.
Hi.
Okay.
Here.
Do you want to tell me about your current setup, if you have one at all? Or?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. My first instinct was to show you my laptop, but you're on it, so it's impossible to do. So I've got a Mac laptop. I also have like GarageBand on my old iMac as well. But my plan is to get Logic because I think that's the thing to do. And then I've got, just bring this over. I've got my mic stand for my condenser with a pop filter, and I had thought a lot about reflection pieces and or shields, and I've sort of haven't pursued taking it further because I lost my voice twice singing this past month, so I have to take a break. But I rented a condenser mic, which I'll just grab. I forget what it is, and let's see.
So is that condenser mic a USB mic, or do you have an interface that it goes into?
I've got a Steinberg, so I was just going to hook it up through that and then into my laptop. So yes, so this is the condenser that I have. And I was using like a newer one, but what I found with that was that one, I think I had it backwards because it was sounding really muffled. And then what happened with it was that I wasn't getting, like, I'd go into Long and McQuaid, I talked to the male sales clerks, and I said, I'm a vocalist, I need something. And then with that mic, I couldn't get like my higher range going through it. I was like, it was getting super distorted, even though I had it through the Steinberg. And so I kind of
Steinberg. Show me this Steinberg. Is this an
sure.
interface? Is this what? I don't even know what the piece of equipment is. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interface, of which for anyone else interested in this, there's many different things. The interface converts your analog signal to digital for your computer in a basic sense, and some of them have a preamp involved that warm it up along the way. When you have a condenser mic, usually the front is the part with the logo on it.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you're running that into your interface and you have the phantom power, which runs condenser mics, it's 48-volt little button in, then theoretically, if you've got it all plugged in, mic to interface to computer, and you have the interface selected from within your DAW, you should get a reasonable signal. If you were, I mean, you said you lost your voice a few times, so I'm like, are you doing punk music? If you're yelling really closely into a condenser, sometimes the capture will freak out and just like block bits of sound. Like if you're singing loudly into a condenser, you usually want to be back a little way. Dynamic microphones are kind of, SM7 being like one that's been used for years, or you'd all be probably familiar with like SM58s that see on stage, is the one with the kind of ball on the top, and they're designed for louder signals for the most part and canceling out a room. Sometimes they're a good option for recording in a home scenario or apartment where there's a lot of background noise, because the dynamic mic's only going to capture, really close to the field of what's going on. If you got lots of cars going past or a really glassy room, the condenser is going to pick up more of that room because it's designed for picking up quieter sounds. And like I said, the further away you get from it, you'll hear more of the room. Depending on what your budget is, there's a thing called a halo that you can get at L&M, which is like this little purple felt kind of dome. It looks like a sound shell, like Hollywood Bowl, I guess. Then it sits much smaller, and it sits on top of your microphone around it and creates like a dead space around the back of it, so it can allow you to sing. When you say dead, I mean dry or non-affected, or not hearing the room sound within a room. If you have something like that, you can still be in a really live, bright room with lots of glass, but get a nice isolated signal without all of the deflections. You can also put Doonas, Aussie word, Doona, duvet, a Doona. You can just pin one of those to a wall behind you, or some people have done podcasts with a duvet over their head in bed with their microphone in order to make sure they're not getting room reflections. Not a very comfortable place for singing vocals necessarily, but if you're handy, you can also make your own room treatments by getting MDF board and some rock wool and pinning material around it and creating panels for your room. It really depends how far you want to go with, treating stuff in your own space. Probably a little overkill for now. So just trying to get that microphone plugged in and making sure you're getting a really clear signal talking into it. Check the buttons on it. Maybe you've got the 20 dB pad on it. What that means is it's taking the overall level down by 20 decibels. So most condenser mics will have that, as well as a high pass filter, which is actually a low cut. It's silly how they do that stuff with the language, but that takes out like usually 100 and below, so that the P's and stuff don't bounce. But these things will kind of affect the sound of your microphone, what those switches are on the condenser. So just make sure you don't have the pad on, and that you're hopefully facing the front of it. Pop filters, great news. If you don't want to spend money on it, you can put a stocking over a coat hanger and make your own pop filter. Not as pretty, but totally works. A really great thing to consider in getting quality home vocals is like having a pop filter between you and the microphone. These little things do make a difference, that and your mic technique. I hope that your scenario works out and that you can get sound out of it. If you can't, just hit me up at Producers Lounge on Instagram. We check that more than our Facebook. I know I saw our Facebook there, but we're a little bit more Insta focused than Facebook. And I can try and troubleshoot it with you, because we've met today. Probably just, might just be flicking around a few buttons, but make sure in whether it's Logic or GarageBand, that you've got the interface selected as your audio outputs, because if that's not input and output, if that's not the case, then it's not going to magically connect.
Cool. And do you think there's a huge variety, like, in terms of mics for vocalists? And kind of goes back to Krystle's question on, doing home studio, and like you get like what feels like a really good take, and then you've got it on your iPhone or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, like, do you encourage people to try around with like my game plan before I lost my voice a couple of weeks back was to like try different microphones every month, like rent a new one from Long and McQuaid, and just kind of see like what's the right fit. So I was just kind of curious if like, now with so many microphone choices, if like the podcast mics are kind of infiltrating, Long and McQuaid too, because I thought, oh, mine is supposed to be for singers, the newer one, but it was just so distorted, and played around with the room setup that I just thought, oh, something's kind of weird there. So maybe it was just more like maybe it didn't get to a pitch that was sort of like above an A or A B. Like
that shouldn't really have an effect. Like obviously if you're singing loudly and stuff, but like what you sing into it, or whether you speak podcast into it, there aren't really there are podcast microphones from a sales point of view, but they're all just collecting analog audio, but usually podcast mics that are USB mics aren't going to be quite as high quality as a condenser mic. If your mic's distorting and doing all that, try recording at a lower volume as a beginning point. Or maybe there's something up with it, because that does sound unusual. As for types of microphones, again, it really depends on budget. So the Rode mics have really great condenser mics that are fairly affordable. It's an Australian company, originally via Scandinavia. They have some of the most accessible but still quality condenser mics. Audio Technica have a couple of nice, pretty affordable condenser mics. When I say that, if you are going to buy a condenser mic, I think spending at least $300 or $400 is a reality. Anything below that is probably, you can obviously, but you might as well use a really good quality dynamic mic at that point. So there's kind of like an entry level, I believe. I don't know, how do you feel about this, Alexis? Do you have particular things that you'd like to recommend? Because Alexis is way more focused than me, so.
I guess, I'm diving into trying to make here, which is fun. So that nerdiness. When it comes to buying mics, remember that there's the used like microphone market. Like you can buy stuff from like Craigslist and there's Marketplace and stuff. So yeah, it's a good place. But when you're first like starting out trying to find what mic sounds the best with your voice, because not every mic is the best and greatest for you. Like some people sound really great on like a Neumann U87, and there's like the vintage ones, the newer ones. There's the SM7, which is really great for ladies' vocals.
I'm gonna pull a few of those out so that we can look at them. Hang on. And
there's like, but like the SM58, which is way more affordable and easy to get, like doing home recordings is actually really great. And like we do records with them anyways, and people perform live with them all the time, so they're kind of more used to singing into them, especially if you like to rock out while you sing. So do that sometimes. Like, and the other thing is you can always ask friends who have gear and borrow stuff. Is other things, like you can make friends with a lot of the recording studios. Like sometimes when I need to borrow a fancier mic, I will just ask Rob at Hipposonic if I can borrow some stuff to record a grand piano in a, because I had a friend with a Steinway on from the 1800s on the Sunshine Coast, so we borrowed some wicked preamps that they had, some Neve preamps and some nice microphones. Yeah, it was pretty lush.
Pretty high end. Pretty high end.
Like, I'm not gonna buy that.
I was gonna say, but you're Alexis Douglas.
Yeah,
so.
I'm like, hang on a second.
Like, through things like this, you now know me. Then there's connections. It's called networking. You ask people and then you negotiate better rental deals by building trustworthy relationships.
This is 100% true, and you don't need to necessarily at the beginning go out and buy something like this, which is a $5,000 U87.
I'm not gonna buy gear. There's enough studios that have lots of gear. I'm just gonna bring my business to studios that have fancier gear and then edit at home.
Yeah.
One thing in Vancouver too is that if you go to Long and McQuaid, I went there with my producer last year, and they had like 15 different microphones set up with the headphones, and you can try every single one.
Yeah.
And even if you're not going to buy it, you can decide if you want to rent it, and you can also get that opportunity of like teaching your ears, like, what do I like? What sounds good to me? And why do I like this? And all the staff there are paid to give you free advice. So you can like learn, you can go into the other room where they have, 20 speakers set up, and you can listen to it through there too. So there's like a lot of options for you to get started with, like, oh, what do I like, or what sounds good, and then going down that rabbit hole too.
There's also the local audio companies that do like live stuff, like Gear Force, for instance. They have lots of studio gear as well that you can also rent from them, and sometimes it's cheaper than going to Long McQuaid. And there's also the recording studios that are at the libraries, which are also kind of sweet if you don't actually have a setup. That's also pretty awesome that we have that in Vancouver.
Amazing.
And then just making friends that have gear and be like, can I borrow this for 2 days, and just negotiate a rate?
Please.
I can afford this budget now, but as I grow, maybe we do fancier things.
So that I think that's a great point, like about the libraries, and then going in and checking stuff out in L&M. And something that Canada has that nowhere else in the world has is the ability to rent really high quality stuff from a place like L&M. Maybe Hippo are pretty generous, but I don't actually let this mic walk from the studio. But it took years before I decided to invest in a $5,000 U87. It's what you'll find like as kind of the standard in a lot of material, as well as even fancier ones in the city, U47s that are worth 20 grand, in some of the studios that you can rent. And obviously that's part of why you pay so much for those studios. This is available at L&M for around about $4,000, the newer version. This is a vintage version, and it is rentable, but the rental fee is probably going to be like $80 or $100 a day. So you're kind of going to want to practice and then, know that you're doing your final vocal sessions when you do that. However, just to go through a few of the microphone types Alexis mentioned to make it a little less confusing, they also make a TLM 10, is it 102 or 104?
There's a 109 as well.
Okay.
Yep.
There's a few that are, they're like, there's a lot of numbers in this world, basically the TLM series are a little bit more accessible for around about $1,000. You can get a version of this rather than 5 if you're looking at investing in having that at home. And also then renting that is obviously much less than renting this one. They're kind of considered the gold standard of condenser mics in a way, Neumann's material. But even if you rent their entry level stuff, it'll give you an idea idea of what they're capable of. AKG is a company that's made incredible flat sounding, and what I mean by that is not kind of with a bass boost like the Dre Beats headphones or anything super enhancing, but it'll give you a very clear and real reproduction of what you're singing. And they have a 214 that I'm going to pull out right now. That is only about $500, and then under that there's kind of some of the Rode mics that can be a little bit cheaper. And this is and the condenser mics, you're noticing they have this certain kind of look and feel to them because they've got this capsule that's about this big in it. And these ones use the phantom power that we're talking about. And then you've got your classic 58 that you would have all seen from live shows, and you can use that in a home recording context, as well as its friend, the 57, which is more commonly used on a snare drum or on an electric guitar amp. It has what people describe as a slightly darker sound, whereas this has more mid-range for the voice. And then this, which is sort of has a relationship to the SM57, it's the SM7, and this microphone, while only costing about $400, it's kind of got this interesting little bit of a windsock on it. Michael Jackson, I keep mentioning him today, I don't know why, but he used this on Thriller. And it's like, it's used in a lot of big pop recordings, and this is a really affordable dynamic mic. If you're punk rock and you're losing your voice, you can yell into this a whole bunch. It doesn't take 48 volt power. Sometimes it's a great option if your apartment's noisy, because it's not going to pick up all the surrounding noise like a condenser mic. But really, I recommend going to L&M and renting a condenser microphone that's within your rental budget to just experiment with it and hear what that's going to work like in your home setup. And you can decide how much you want to spend on that for the week. There's really a lot of options, whether it's a Rode mic or an AKG or one of the Neumann's cheaper series like the TLM 104 or 109. Alexis is like wanting to say no. It's something.
Put the reminder out there, if you get a ribbon mic, don't put phantom power on it, you'll kill it.
Yeah.
They're
so
great.
phantom, yeah. And probably a ribbon mic, unless you've like got very specific desires to record horns or have a really dark vocal sound. It's not the place to begin with experimenting with microphones. It's a bit more of an advanced technique because you record it with a certain sound and then you EQ it differently. So like getting a hold of a nice condenser microphone is a great start point. Running it through a decent interface, which like Focusrite have these great little scarlet red interfaces that are super accessible for only a couple $100. Yes.
Rupert Neve's design, and he's the one that made the Neve consoles, which are one of the greatest preamps in the world. So yeah, Focusrite is a great affordable starter option. And they're
how much Alexis loves you. Yeah, totally. So Focusrite for only a couple $100, they've got this little red interface that it'll convert your signal from your microphone to get it into your computer in a beautiful way. It'll allow you to monitor. Obviously, having a set of headphones for your home recording setup is important, maybe even more important than monitors in the early stage, especially for apartment living. If you can't be that loud, like you only have a certain budget, the mic, the interface, the computer, the headphones is your start point.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You also get the dynamic mics. They're also really great for when you start then transitioning from the recording and then you start touring and then you have your clean microphone that no one else shares with you, especially in this age of COVID. If you are a singer and you run around with your own personal microphone that no one else touches, then you're probably not going to get COVID from someone else sharing the mic.
Good point. Or cooties, right? Because who wants other people's saliva anyways? Yeah. I know Jill had her hand raised. Victoria had her hand raised. And I'm just wondering if, was it Aviva that had a question about grant language? Was your question answered in the chat sufficiently?
Can you hear me? Can you see?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Did you have a question about language?
Well, yeah, I had a question about language and tone. First of all, I'm based out of Quebec. I'm not out of BC. So I don't have access to any of things. I don't have access to any of like the BC creative grants or anything like that. So I'm talking more about, let's say, Canada Council of Arts, SOCAN, Factor, things that are more available to like nationwide. And I'm questioning about tone because like I'm so used to writing business plans. Like I have a business background and I don't know how much, should I refer to myself in the third person? Is this going to be like a business plan where I'm really setting up budgets and financial plans, or is it really more something that I'm communicating my cultural value as an artist, and I'm being more personal, because I'm a lot of the grants that I'm applying for are more geared towards cultural, sharing my culture, being a woman of color, things of that nature. So I want to know, like, to which level should I really, should my tone really dictate, like in my grant proposal when I'm writing a grant?
I would say again that it depends on the specific grant, and with those organizations that you just mentioned, Canada Council will accept either, like a very personalized account, because they're art focused and art forward and culture forward, whereas Factor is very much about measurable elements for the most part. You might be more likely to write that in third person. Also, check in again with the guidelines on the individual grant you're applying for when the deadline's coming up. See what they're looking for in those scoring charts and in the guidelines. And if you can talk to someone from the organization, just ask them that question to make sure in that instance of that particular grant that you do the thing that they're most, likely to accept and be into. But I'd say as a broad concept that Factor, again, is more business oriented and measurables oriented, where Canada Council is more creative and cultural oriented. But yeah, the more research you do about a particular grant and the nuances of its guidelines and who it's historically supported, the more you might sort of know which tone to have. It's great that you've got that business background, because that's actually harder to acquire that if you haven't done that. And you don't necessarily need to strip that down in terms of the way that you're doing it. You can just add those personable elements.
Add the creative. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We've got a hand raised from Jill, Victoria, and Caitlin, and it looks like Sajia. So we only have 15 minutes left. Maybe we could get everybody like about 4 minutes.
I'm
Jill,
open. I mean, depends with y'all, but I'm happy to go a few minutes over time if people really have burning questions, just so you know.
Amazing. And is it okay if people maybe email you or dialogue with you on your Producers Lounge Instagram?
The Producers Lounge Instagram is probably the best pathway for further questions. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for that. So go ahead, Jill.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah. So we're going to be starting a tour in June, and yeah, it's a lot to learn. And I think the biggest thing is the grant writing thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not good with writing and in general, so it might help everyone to if maybe you can give us like some key highlight points on maybe what grant writers, like if they're going to give you a grant, if you know what they're looking for, like what are the really things that, say if somebody wants to approve, what are the things that would give them that, oh yeah, we need to approve? You know what I mean? I guess.
I do know what you mean. It comes back again to that, like, knowing your grant and the specific guidelines of that grant is very important. So if you're going to be touring,
Yes.
you're going to be looking at travel grants.
Yeah.
And in the case of travel grants, the ones that are available in the province, some of them are just for a couple $1,000s, so it's not going to cover everything in a crazy way. They're actually relatively easy to get. They move through pretty quickly, those ones. And they're going to want to know that you've got at least 2 or 3 dates booked. This is in the case of Music BC's travel grants, and that you've got contacts in those places. And I think it's always great if you can involve a local band on the lineup, because regional engagement is often one of the tick boxes, like how are you going to benefit local community if you're moving through places that are different to where you've come from as an artist. Is there, I know you sort of said you don't love writing, is there anyone else in your group, you did say we, that is like more business trained that you could do that with? Or
Not really. It's just my husband and I, and we do everything.
It's often the way. Well, I think that, going and having a look at those travel grants that are available, they're quarterly here, and looking at the guidelines, how many dates you have to have booked and what material they're looking for. I think being able to show the output that you've got, why your goals are to travel to the particular places you're traveling, if you have an existing fan base there, if you don't, proving that you can connect with a local act and that's going to be fruitful is important. And again, it's that tricky thing. It's like knowing your specific grant. There isn't one way to present yourself. It's more like if you can work out how to present the most appropriately to that set of questions, and that's where it's kind of like your persuasive essay writing from high school that you want to channel a little bit. It's like looking at those guidelines and point systems and then making sure you cover those things as to how they're going to score your application. And then if you haven't done much of it before, absolutely get in touch and ask if there's an opportunity for them to review or give feedback on your application before you put it in, of which there often is.
Oh, okay. So you can actually ask the grant people to review it for you?
Absolutely, or ask, or are there any gaps in this? Are there elements that are missing from this? And they'll give you more specific advice than me, because they're the folks that are going to be, you know, judging that particular, well, not necessarily judging, overseeing the program. It depends.
Right.
Sometimes there's a jury, sometimes it's the organization itself. But
Okay.
as broad advice, it's just so important that you read the guidelines and the scoring per application, because it's different across the board, depending on whether you're going for travel, recording, business, and there's a vast amount of info in there to support you, and the organizations really do want people to succeed and to make art where we live. We're very lucky.
Right. Awesome. Great. Thank you. That's great.
There's a couple of Music BC travel grants. I think one's open right now and the deadline is sometime in March. I hope it hasn't passed, but then there's another one for your June. There might be another deadline available. And they're really quite straight. The travel grants are quite straightforward, because you're not necessarily trying to convince them that your creative project is viable for sale. You know, it's like, we're going on tour. Here are the dates. So I think you might have a lot of success if you look into one of those ones for sure.
Really.
Caitlin,
Okay.
you have your hand up.
Awesome. Thanks.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit of what I've learned along the way. I've had some success with grants. I've been really fortunate. So a lot of the things people have already said, I want to echo that. What I think is really important is that you have a super clear idea of what your project is going to look like when it's finished, and work backwards from there. And sometimes that's hard for us artists because we're, you know, spontaneous, but it's important to have a really clear idea of what you're wanting to achieve, work backwards so that you have your who, where, when, why, what, that you have a clear understanding of like the scope of your project, your timeline, and your budget. Because a lot of these funding bodies want to see a project proposition that's feasible. They want to look at your project and go, yeah, this person is capable of doing this and they look like they're going to succeed. Letters of support, I know Alexis just mentioned that. Those are so key, they're so important. I'd say they've been a huge part of my success with grants. And some people get really intimidated about having to write those. So what you can do is make like a template of a letter for people and basically write the letter for them. Say, this is kind of what I want in the letter. If you want to make changes, you want to add or take anything away, absolutely, by all means. If you just want to sign off on it, cool. But that way you're going to get a lot more letters rather than people kind of wanting to support you, but maybe just being too busy or too intimidated about that.
That is such great advice on the letters of support, such a vital component, and writing it for folks, especially if you're approaching folks that are really busy, you know, and you're trying to engage people that are fairly involved in the industry, as long as you know them personally and you have a rapport. I love it when people write the support letter and I can just add a few little personalized elements and wipe the signature on. Last career development, I think I wrote 34 letters of support. So it's like folks that are, they're going to want that. That's great advice, as well as having a clear idea of the end result. I guess that's similar to what I was saying before about being assertive, as if it's already happening, being able to fully see your project formulated so you can describe it from all angles, so it's easier to sell it to them in a way. And sometimes we miss out, you know, when we don't like business very much. I know a few people like, I'm not very business oriented or experienced. Like I do recommend reading Creative Quest, that Questlove book, in terms of just thinking a little bit differently about how you can cleverly, creatively engage. It won't specifically help you with grant writing, but remembering that grant writing is a great opportunity to do a business plan without doing a business plan. And we could all use a little bit of that. And grants, you know, in this province especially, are kind of so incredible in how much information they require that it really does force you ultimately to kind of consider all the implications, financial implications, creative implications of your project, and help you identify gaps. And you want to try and fill those gaps, you know, with other folks that you can either provide support letters from, other collaborators. Be really honest with yourself as you see your project against those guidelines and scoring lines, if there is anything that you can improve, and be as far along with your idea as you can before you present it. Like if you're really not ready yet, you'll probably be able to tell along the way of the process, and these things come around annually. So, there's no harm in applying that first year and getting feedback, but it's also really great to make sure you're ready if you're going for a really large amount of money, because it might be disappointing if you put a huge amount of time in, but you don't have the full vision for the project yet. And, it's, yeah, there are so many opportunities locally. I saw a thing in the chat, someone asking how have grants changed recently. They've just become more accessible to people from more diverse backgrounds and to women, where historically dudes been getting 70% of the money, and now that's really flipped to being the other way around, which is good for all of us in the room right now.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Yeah, grants are definitely a lot more accessible now, and accessible not only to who they're opening it up to and prioritizing, but as it's been mentioned many times, they're offering coaching sessions, they're offering, review sessions, they're offering so many steps to help you get that money that you just have to sort of go and get it at that point, right? You just got to put that work in. So I think we'll take one last question. Sajia, you had a question that you wanted to ask?
Yes. Okay. So I've never actually done professional recordings before. I've only done a very lo-fi couple of recordings, and actually deleted one of them from my archives because it was very poor quality. Is it still worth it to apply for a grant, or should I wait until I have more professional sounding recordings?
It definitely is a benefit to have a recording that's a little more high quality than lo-fi, although lo-fi can be cool sometimes depending on the style these days. But I would say, again, it depends on which grant you're applying for. If it's a first time demo grant for an artist, as part of that application, it's clear that you're not going to have a pre-existing recording because it's for emerging artists that don't have recordings. Whereas applying for something like career development or Canada Council's a bit of a gray area. Sometimes you can put lo-fi recordings in if the strength of your overall artistic vision is strong enough. But I would say it depends on the type of thing you're going for. So if you don't have any and you don't have access to make those, then going for emerging demo-based grants where that's not one of the expectations for upload is probably the smartest way to go about it.
Like Vancouver has a very good demo grant. I just looked it up. That's available, but it's only for people who live in Vancouver City itself. And I live in Westminster, which is outside the borders.
I know, it's so tough. Do you have anyone with an address in Vancouver that you it's a tricky one, that one. There are some BC Arts Council grants that have a cultural focus that will allow you to make demos as well. So have a look at what the BC Arts Council has for those emerging applications. Maybe has anyone else got a note on that? It depends on the state of your career. My first grant, I used a phone recording, but I had extensive performance history and letters of support. Okay, so it can work. Like when you're saying lo-fi, if your performance is really strong and you like do your best to learn to position your phone in the right place in the room, and it's a nice sounding room, and you play and sing, I don't know what, if you play guitar in a beautiful way, you do multiple performances to make sure that you get the best possible result that you can with what you've got to work with. That's the most important. And if your music is more acoustic or traditional instrument based, I don't what do you play? Do you play or do you just sing?
I'm a singer and dancer, but I've been recently working on my keyboard skills, but I'm not a strong keyboardist. But I can like create good tunes based on what I know.
Great. So just finding the best way to capture that in the room with your iPhone and going for those emerging demo grants, but doing even within the gear that you have the best capture that you can, making sure you perform it a few times and choose the best performance is a good idea.
I think that's, yeah, that's great advice. If I can add to that, I think really knowing the goal as to what you want from the grant, you know, whatever it is that you're applying for, be so clear on that. Like if you're applying for a demo to make a really great song in a real studio, then it's the demo grant you want, you know. If you want a full album, often they're going to want the track listings and the times and everything and the names of these tracks. So you have to be a little bit more developed if it's like a full album track that you want to be applying for. Just like with a travel grant, they're going to want to know all of the secure dates that you have. If you have anchor dates, which means that you are, you know, getting paid a little bit more for a more solid, established sort of a performance in a place. I'm going all over the place with this kind of information, but you know, it just depends on what you're applying for, and then you can kind of decide. You know, if it's that nice raw thing, then the demo grant might be the one for you, where that demo performance. I've heard people not get demo grants because they had too polished of a sound, you know. So you might as well, yeah, kind of
Totally true.
Yeah.
you got with, yeah. It looks like Alexis has her hand up, and maybe that will be our last comment, and we'll call it a day.
Add to some other grants that you can apply to through Factor. You can get $750 to attend a songwriting workshop, like a showcase thing. And I know for another artist that I helped them to write an artist development one, and then we did that one, and then they went to the Northern Exposure Conference, which is ran by the same people who run Artswells. So it was like all of the festivals in like Northern BC are there, and then you just get to go to this camp for songwriters and artists, and then you get to do a little performance, get paid to be there, and then you learn and you meet all these other people, and then suddenly their entire tour was booked for the next summer and they hadn't toured before. So sometimes instead of getting a travel grant, you can get money to attend like a skills workshop for songwriters, or things like the music incubator projects, which then help train you in how to do like some of the businessy stuff.
That's a really good point. Like all of the mentorship available at the moment, that could be a hybrid with some recording involved if you're smart. Yeah. Like even though we're saying know what your grant is, there's also ways that you can be super creative with that. And Music BC also in their newsletter always lists all of the upcoming deadlines. So joining the Music BC newsletter is a good idea.
Please. I did join Music BC newsletter a couple of years ago, but they never sent me their newsletters.
Oh, maybe you'll have to again.
Yeah. I checked my spam, so it's not that.
So yes, I think we will do our best to put, like we've been asked to put links together and create maybe a page that we can post either on our website or part of our newsletter to send out all of these amazing resources. I just want to thank everybody first, because all of this collective knowledge is truly powerful, and it's amazing that we can all be here together and share all of this incredible experience and knowledge. And so much, a huge, massive Emergence BC and personal thank you to Jane Aurora. Can we just all give her a huge bit of love for being here and sharing your incredible knowledge and experience? Can we make a song together? Because I want to get in the studio with you and like
I'd love to. I mean, that's my favorite thing to do. It's very exciting to be talking about it, but yeah, getting amongst it is my favorite thing. I want to say It's been an absolute privilege to be here and to watch the amazing work that Emergence has been doing within the community for the last couple of years, and I'm glad I was finally able to be part of a session. Myself, Producers Lounge, the studio are always open to supporting up and coming self-produced artists that want to make recordings. It's not just myself, but a few other folks that are up and coming producers that work out of the space as well. And feel free to get in touch with us at Capsule Studios too, specifically if you want to find a female producer and work out of this smaller space. It's just it is a very exciting time for us here in this environment with our local community supporting each other in the ways that we do, and I hope we can do some things together in the future.
Thank you so much, Jane. I think it is very exciting. If I had these kind of resources 10 years ago, 15 years ago when I started, I would have just been like, I would have been taking over the world. No, I'd be exactly where I am right now because this is the best community, and building this kind of stuff is the best place to be. So thank you all for being here. If you would like to continue these conversations, we have a WhatsApp group for Emergence that is very casual, that you can just kind of type in your queries if you're just kind of wondering something one day. Of course, there's the larger community. You can join Producers Lounge, follow them on Instagram, Facebook. You can follow us as well, Emergence BC on Instagram, Facebook. We've got a newsletter that goes out monthly, as does Producers Lounge. So sign up, join the community. Let's be a part of each other's lives and careers, people. This is amazing. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time. But Lola, do you know what the next session's going to be?
I do. Thank you, Krystle. So our next workshop is going to be on April 9th, and it will be an express session. So it'll be shorter than this session. And the topic is translating your talent visually with online content. And Catherine Penfold, Deirdre, and Krystle will be with us for that session.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your weekends, and if it's your weekend, and we'll see you next time. I'm so excited that this was such a wonderful session. So thanks again for being here, and thank you, Jane.